Okay, so last time we started on chapters 12 through 14. You got somewhere into chapter 13, I believe. I'm
As
going
long as
to
that's
assume
maybe
maybe we did a little bit of 14,
that'll
but
tell you right away if it's quit.
I'm going to go back and have us look at 13:9. So Revelation 13, verse 9. Maybe I don't have it right. Starting in verse 9. So it goes like this. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. Then if you would also look at me at chapter 14, verse 12. It goes like this. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints who obey God's commandments and remain faithful to Jesus. These two are very parallel. They're markers. And so what their goal is to set off what happens in between chapter 13, verse 9 and 14, verse 12 as something that Christians, as followers of Jesus, should pay particular attention to. We might construe it as a big parentheses. What I'm going to do is you mark your text with a parentheses at 13:9, open parentheses, and then ending the parentheses at 14:12. Or you might think of it as a picture frame. Picture framing is a common technique in the first century among authors. So what happens here is that these two statements, form a frame of a picture. And so when you think of a frame, I think I've mentioned this before, look at any picture, you go to the frame. The frame helps interpret what's inside the picture, and the picture also helps interpret the frame. So if you look over the mantle, there's a picture of the Organ Mountains. If we were to put that in a different type of frame, let's say a thin metal frame, it would look very different than it does in that dark wood frame. And so in the text, what happens is when you do a picture frame, we think of the frame as an interpretive role. Just if you were to take that picture out of the frame, it would look very different as well. As an interpretive role to help us think about what's going on inside. And so we should think of these verses, chapter 13, verse 9, all the way through 14:12 as part of this framed picture. And that frame of paying attention, that we should be alert to this, is sort of warns us that what happens in between is of great serious import to us as Christians. So let's start by thinking about what happens in between there. And the first thing that happens is we have the persecution of those who refuse to worship the image of the beast. And that's followed by a description of the persecution of those who refuse to take the mark of the beast. We have a song that's sung by 144,000 with the Lamb on Mount Zion. And then we have three angels who are in the air, in the midst of the air. I guess that's because they're kind of not on the ground, they're not totally in heaven, they're kind of in between, who make pronouncements. The first one goes all around the earth proclaiming the gospel and calling for people to repent because God's judgment has come. The second makes an announcement of the fall of Babylon. And the third is a warning to all those who worship the beast and take the mark on their forehead or their hand that they will face the second death or condemnation in the eternal lake of fire. So we're going to kind of break some of those down here in a minute. But I can't remember if we talked about what the number of the beast means. This is a very popular topic.
Yeah, we did.
We did.
Let's just review it real quick, just so you understand what we're talking about. For a long time, people did not understand what this word means. We may not still understand what they mean by this, but in 1831, biblical scholars figured this out. Probably that was about the same time that we began excavating at Pompeii. It had been consumed by a volcano explosion of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. And the reason why that is because we found lots of graffiti in Pompeii that helped shed some light on what was going on possibly with this number 666. So I mentioned this before, I'm just going to kind of go through it again. I've gotten asked for this before as well, but again, in both Greek and Hebrew, those languages do not use a number system like that we use Arabic numbers. They do not use a number system. Instead, they use the alphabet to double as their numbers. And so in Greek, alpha means the first letter of the alphabet is also the number 1, beta is number 2, and so forth. When we get after that, we get to beyond 10, we start having 20, 30, 100, and so forth. Okay, so we take the letters of that are used here, the number 666. We know that in the specific verb that's used to describe what's happening here, it's telling us that this is a process of this number stands for a name or a person. So for instance, at Pompeii, there was a graffito. One graffito that was found was, "I love the girl whose number is 545." So we don't know who that was, but it's like carving in a tree, so to speak. There's an early Christian piece of literature after the New Testament called the Christian Sibylline Oracles, and in that book, the name of it says that the name of the incarnate Son of God is 888, and that makes perfect sense because we can take the name Jesus in Greek, which is Jesus. The Greek letters iota, eta, sigma, omicron, upsilon, sigma, Jesus. And for instance, iota is the Greek number 10. Eta is the Greek number 8. Sigma is the Greek number 200. Omicron is the Greek number 70. Upsilon is the Greek number 400, and sigma is 200. And we add those together, and we come up with 888. We know that there is a specific technique known. I'll give you this nice word that'd be good for, I don't know, crossword puzzle maybe. Isosephism. That's where, in this process of using these numbers, letters add up to numbers, that you have two statements, two phrases that add up to the same number, in which they're said then to be, that seems to indicate some sort of connection between the two. So if you look carefully in Revelation, it says, I need to get to the verse again.
You mean the 666 group?
Yes. Where it says, "Let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is a man's number, and his number is 666. Okay? So, the word for beast adds up in Greek to, well, actually what we do is we take the Greek word for beast and we transliterate it into Hebrew letters. And then we add them up, because the Hebrew is the same thing, and you get the number. Anyone want to guess what the word beast is? 666. And then we said the other person whose name adds up to 666
Nero.
is Nero. Yes, is Caesar Nero. And and the reason why that's important, we'll see. This is going to come up again later on, but if you look with me at chapter 17. Verse 11, It talks about, we're going to be talking about more about the beast tonight. The beast who once was and now is not is an eighth king. He belongs to the seven and is going to his destruction. Okay, so at the time of the writing of Revelation, it either is written during the time of Nero, but most scholars now think that it was written during the time of Domitian, about 20 or so years later. At that time, Nero was dead, and he had been alive, and he had died, and there was this great fear. He was assassinated. There was this great fear that he was, in Christian prophecy and Jewish prophecy, all spoke to this, that Nero was going to come back. He was going to come back alive and bring his evil with him, that he would reign again. Sort of like, in the context of Revelation, this may make sense. I know this is a theory, but this may make sense because if you look carefully at Revelation, what does Satan do, the dragon do in Revelation? He seeks to mimic Jesus in every single way he can. So he has the beast do miracles, and the beast dies and comes back to life. The second beast, the first beast, and the second beast proclaims him. It all kind of fits as he's trying to mimic, as like a false prophet or a false Christ, as that's why they got the name Antichrist, someone who's against Christ, but also who mimics Christ and deceives the world. There is also, I point out to you that Nero, and actually is in the Roman historian Suetonius, and he's in his book on the 12 Caesars. He divided his work on the 12 Caesars into books, a book for each emperor, and the one on Nero, in chapter 39 of the one on Nero, he makes this statement: a new calculation, Nero killed his own mother. So Nero in Greek is 1005, when you add it up, in Greek, not in Hebrew, notice, and killed his own mother, if you add that up, also equals 1005. So you have sort of an example, and it was a popular rumor, which turns out historians think is true, that Nero was guilty of matricide, of killing assassinating his own mother, Agrippina. So, the point that most people think is that this numerology approach, it's called gematria, doesn't merely assert that Nero is the beast, it demonstrates that he is, because his name is a demonstration of that he is the beast, by adding it up and adding the number for the beast up. So you can agree with that, or maybe not agree. I think one thing is clear, though, I think we can say, is that as we look in chapter 17, as we hopefully will tonight, and that is that Nero, one like Nero, fits in, coming back to life, fits into the description of the beast in chapter 17. So that's sort of the section about that. Remember, this beast, he makes war, and authorized by Satan the dragon, against the followers of Jesus, and we are warned that he will be successful in conquering them, and then we should take notice of that, and that also we are to take notice carefully. This is repeated over again. If you take this mark, if you swear allegiance to the beast, in other words, you have no place with God in heaven. You will be condemned for that. So it's a warning to us: don't take the mark. We will have to. It's also a warning that we will have to. That those who face that will have to suffer greatly, because they will be conquered by the beast. Because God is going to allow them to happen. Their conquering, though, is also the way that they defeat the beast, because they give the testimony. Chapter 12 points out the testimony of those who follow Jesus, and the blood of the Lamb are what ultimately defeats Satan. And we'll see eventually how they are defeated. So that's sort of that first big scene, this persecution of the saints by using a combination of economic pressure and also outright persecution for failing to swear allegiance to the beast or worship the beast. Then also in chapter 14, verses 1 through 5, we have a description of the Lamb and the 144,000. So let's turn to chapter 14.
Did Nero at this time require any kind of mark?
No. No. So verses 1 through 5 is the description that I like to look at this next thing and just think about this. Then it says, "Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. And with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they kept themselves pure. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among men and offered as first fruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless." Okay, so when you hear this scene read, what comes to your mind? What kinds of imagery do you think? What kinds of things develop in your mind as you hear this? Anyone?
At this time.
Sure.
Well, it's like the Lamb's inner circle. I mean, they seem like a special cadre,
Okay.
like his,
144,000.
Okay. Although they're not associated, we're not told that they are the Jews in this place or the tribes of Israel. So, anyone else? Anyone know where Mount Zion is?
Where Jerusalem is.
Okay. Any particular part of Jerusalem? Do you know?
The Temple Mount.
Right. The biblical Mount Zion is not the same as modern Mount Zion. The biblical Mount Zion is the temple, where the temple is located. The original part of the city of Jerusalem, just to the north of it, and so that's called biblical Mount Zion. Now the problem we have is that if you remember throughout Revelation, we have what on earth mimics what's in heaven. So the question a lot of scholars ask is this scene taking place in heaven or is it taking place on the earth? Because if they sing a new song before the throne, and yet they're also on Mount Zion. So it's hard to you have kind of to think about that as a possibility. Which is being referred to here? How are these 144,000 identified?
Virgins.
pure,
The name of the Lamb on their forehead and on their hands.
Yes, they have the name of the Lamb and of the Father written on their foreheads. Okay. Throughout Revelation, people will have who they follow, who they believe in, who they are closely allied with, written on their foreheads. So they have the name of the Lamb and of God on their written on their foreheads, and they it talks about their purity. Now it says literally, these are those who do not defile themselves with women but kept themselves pure. The problem. Well, let me ask, what do you think that means? Because
it's only men.
I think so.
Well, or they could not have been lesbians. No bis or anything.
Okay.
But I mean, at first, when they had to defile themselves with women, you first think, well, are they all men?
Okay.
Or are they women who also didn't defile themselves with women?
Okay. One thing I like to point out is that everyone thinks that this does not refer to people who have remained virgins. This refers to people who have not defiled themselves. The Bible does not consider sexual relations between a husband and a wife to be defiling. So these are people who have avoided defilement by engaging in sexual acts that are not legitimate. Okay, and they sing a new song. What do we know about this new song they sing?
Only they can sing it. No one else knows what it is.
No one could learn the song.
No one can learn the song unless you're one of those 144,000. Okay, and so they sing this new song before the throne. We can read more about it. It says this in verse 5, no lie was found in their mouths, they are blameless. And so we have this scene. So why do you think God wants us to have this scene at this point in Revelation? Why do you want John to see this, do you think?
Because he'd already seen all this really ugly stuff.
Okay,
So there is hope.
okay.
There's something besides all the ugly stuff.
Hmm? Okay. And then from this we go on to the angels flying in the midair. The first one to proclaim the gospel, that's in verse 6. And 7. And then if you look with me further on in 14, we have the second angel who comes after him and declares, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. That's an important statement because it prefigures what we're going to be talking about here in a little bit in chapter 17, about in chapter 18, where this is kind of fleshed out. So this declaration of the angel, like a herald, brings our attention to that as well. And then finally, third angel says, if anyone worships the beast and his image and receives the mark on the forehead or on the hand, he too will drink of the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. He will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever. There is no rest, day or night, for those who worship the beast and his image, or for anyone who receives the mark of his name. So putting all that together, what do you think God is trying to say to us in this parentheses, in this picture frame, that we should pay attention to? Points it out that we should be aware of it in chapter 13, beginning verse 9, and then in chapter 14, verse 12, it reminds us about it. What is God wanting us to pay attention to? What does he want us to remember, you think, from this picture that he's painting for us?
Remain faithful to Jesus.
Remain faithful to Jesus. Okay? Can you be anything more than that?
Patient endurance.
Okay, patient endurance.
That we should be identified with him. People should see that.
Okay.
He doesn't want to put us in his wrath. He doesn't want to put his wrath upon us.
I noticed that Babylon gives wine to drink, and God is going to also give wine to drink.
Yes.
And it's like, again, it's a parallelism. To be careful as to what we participate in, because his wrath and the wine of his fury will be final, and hers is temporary.
It defiles as well. Her wine, maddening wine of her adulteries.
It made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. And if you participate in that, it says, then you're going to drink of the wine of God's fury.
Right. One thing I point out to you is that Revelation is trying to say to us is that this is going to be a difficult time for Christians. There are going to be difficult choices that you have to make that will have severe consequences for you. But that you're called to make the choice that, in light of what's going to, where things stand for eternity, rather than what happens temporarily. And it may mean that you will suffer. It may even mean that you die. But it will also mean that you have a place with God in heaven. But if
In
you
this new creation.
make the wrong choice, then you face God's wrath and judgment forever. When put in that kind of perspective, if I were to tell you, you can eat a piece of cake tonight, like we had, and enjoy it, or if you eat the piece of cake, you're going to hell. How many of you would eat the piece of cake? Not many. At least if you pause to think about what you're actually facing, what the decisions you make. So what Revelation is doing is saying to you and to us, we need to look carefully what's happening around us and choose carefully, because it has eternal consequences. It has eternal implications. And we should not compromise what we believe and who we trust in for the sake of temporary comfort. Now, a person living in the first century, reading this in Asia Minor, they face all sorts of issues on a daily basis that impacts whether they can work, that impacts what's going to happen to them. They're expected to participate in civic festivals and civic ceremonies that involve the worship of idols, and especially the worship of the emperor. And failing to participate in those would make them be seen as if they were treasonous and subject to persecution. It might cost them their job if they refuse to participate. It could have all sorts of huge impacts on them. And John is saying that God has told him that there's going to be even more, a time when the impact will even be greater than what they're experiencing. But the message is still the same about being very careful of the choices that you make and where your loyalties lie. Okay. The rest of chapter 14 concludes with, after the section, with the harvest of the earth. And did we talk about this last time? I can't remember if we did or not. Okay, so in response to the statement in verse 12 about calling for patient endurance, a voice from heaven says in verse 13, right, this is one of the 7 Beatitudes of the book of Revelation, right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. And then in verse 14, you see this phrase, I looked. And I just want to remind you, whenever you see that I looked or I saw, they're actually the same word, it's just a different form. That is a marker in this book that there's a new scene happening. So we move on to a new scene or a new subject. So he says, I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man. Who is the son? Jesus. He talks about that. Do you know where the term comes from that Jesus used to apply to himself?
Isn't it Ezekiel?
No, not Ezekiel. Might be, but the main one I'm referring to is not from Ezekiel. It's in Daniel.
Okay, yeah.
In Daniel chapter 7, and it's an important concept for Christians to understand. Mark reports that this is ultimately what Jesus got killed, because in the trial before the high priest, they asked him, "Are you the Messiah? Are you the Christ? Tell us." And he said, he described himself as the Son of Man and coming on the clouds. And so then they tear their garments and declare blasphemy. They kill him for it. They condemn him for it. So the scene is the Son of Man. He's coming on a cloud, just like it talks about in Daniel. He has in his hand a sickle. Everyone knows what a sickle is?
Chop down wheat.
Yes, it's a
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a,
curved
yeah.
knife thing. Okay. Verse 15, then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe. The angel swung a sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles, for a distance of 1,600 stadia. Any scholars here know how much that is? 1,600 stadia. It's about 145 miles.
That's a lot of
No,
grapes.
no, for 1,600 stadia.
My Bible says 184 miles. About.
About.
Yeah, 180, about 300 kilometers.
So how long is it? 100?
About 100 and, I don't
So
know.
I'll tell you,
Somewhere in
it's
the
183.98 miles. Okay, so, because one stadia, or stadia, is 607.14 feet. Okay, so you can do the math, that makes 971,424 feet, or 183.98 miles. A stadia or stadia is the equivalent to is basically what a Roman mile. Or actually, there are so many stadia, 10 there are 10 stadia in a Roman mile. So you can kind of figure that out. It's a lot of blood, right? Okay, so we have two scenes in this last part. We have the Son of Man on a cloud comes down and takes a sickle and harvests the earth. Then we have another scene where an angel is sent out with another sickle, and the angel that attends the fire at the altar in heaven gives him instructions to go harvest the grapes of the earth, the vine of the earth, of which they put into God's winepress, where it's treaded, and out comes God's wrath. Does that sound familiar to anyone?
When I'm coming up.
Yes, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. That's where they took that imagery from. And have anyone here ever been to the Lincoln Memorial? Okay. You ever read, when you go to Lincoln Memorial, if you look on the walls, they have the Gettysburg Address inscribed there. They have something there that most Americans, I don't think, remember. They have Lincoln's second inaugural address. And if you look at that inaugural address, Lincoln believed, which was also the inspiration for this, not the song, but the song also reflects the same belief, that that the Civil War was God's judgment upon America for slavery, and that the payment of human blood and suffering was the punishment that God enacted on this country because of the sin of slavery. And so that understanding is rooted in the same kinds of concept, which hence the Battle of the Republic draws from, that when the soldiers go out and they're fighting the Civil War, that they are instruments of God's wrath and judgment upon the nation. So that leads us to this, it concludes a section of 12 through 14, which we talked about was sort of an alternative, actually was a sort of an alternative strand to the series of sevens, that they both climax at the same point with the bowls of God's wrath. And we've already talked about the bowls of God's wrath. But they're parallel accounts that meet up at the same place, coming from different places. And so since we've already talked about the bowls of God's wrath, and the series of sevens have concluded with that, I want us to turn now to chapter 17 of the book of Revelation.
The first harvest, you get that harvest from the good people or bad people? The two angels do
Oh no, the
Jesus
Son of
did-
Man does the harvest, and the two angels harvest the grapes of God's wrath. So there's a,
Is there an implication that the first harvest was Jesus' pick, like he said, of good?
certainly there are plenty of commentators who like to come up with those ideas.
Wow.
But they can have good arguments for it. They also can have arguments the other side but I guess I didn't touch on it because frankly, the text doesn't make it clear. I don't know the answer to that question though. It is popular among those who believe in premillennialism and pre-rapture to say that that's what's happening here. This is another example of evidence of the rapture. And it's not that I don't believe in the rapture. I do believe in the rapture because I think it's described in a couple of places in the Gospels by Jesus, but also by Paul in his letters. But I don't see the rapture specifically described as the rapture in Revelation. It may be alluded to by some of these images, but it's not specifically described. So hence, what happens is that interpreters try to put together a composite description of the end times. And so they'll take references from the Old Testament, from Daniel, from Ezekiel, from other places. They'll take references from the Gospels. They'll take references from Paul, where Paul talks about it, and also from 1 Peter, 2 Peter, other places, and they'll put in Revelation, and they'll try to put together a composite description where everything all comes out neat and matches up. In my opinion, at least what I'm trying to do in this study, at least with you, is not to get too heavily involved in that, because to me it's like a rabbit's trail, and I don't know where you come out, because there's so many people get caught into that and come out with so many different places. It depends on which text. You have to make all sorts of interpretive decisions. For instance,
I just
you have to decide which text is going to be the dominant text in which you interpret all the other texts. And how do you do that? It's a personal judgment call. And so it becomes very complicated, and that's why people have the doctrine of eschatology. There's whole books written about eschatology, but Revelation per se, as a book by itself, doesn't have that as its purpose to put together a systematic description of the end times.
I just noticed something.
Yes.
Y'all, look in verse 15. Notice the angel is commanding Jesus what to do.
Yes.
I never noticed that till now. The angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud. Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. Is that an allusion to when Jesus said to his disciples, I do not know the time?
Well, that would be the first thing you know in mind.
First thing
Acts
came to
chapter
my
1.
mind, remember? So now the angel is coming from God the Father and is instructing Jesus, do it. Because usually we expect Jesus to command the angels.
Well, if you look at that, let's look at this real briefly. Turn to Acts chapter 1. You have a Bible.
Because Jesus said, I do not know the hour. That's like the timing of God's time. God the Father. So that would be true of the scripture.
I never understand when they make Bibles on really thin paper. It makes it hard to read. I've never understood that.
Cosmic.
No, they think it like some sort of makes it some special thing because anyway. In verse 6, he said, the disciples asked Jesus, one of their last statements, their questions to Jesus. They say, so when they met together, they asked him, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel, which is basically going to bring you judgment? And he said to them, it is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority. But this verse should be familiar for you from today's worship. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and the ends of the earth. So there's another place, I'm trying to remember where, he says he doesn't even know Matthew yet. He doesn't know the day or the time. Only the Father knows.
Is this the only time in Scripture where an angel directs the Son of Man what to do?
As far as I know.
Yeah, it's sort of radical, and I've never really noticed.
What are you reading?
Verse 15, where?
Of chapter 14.
I'll start, I'm sorry. 14. With the new scene. John says, I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And when Jesus ascended in Acts, the angels, the two guys, told the disciples, why are you standing there looking up? He's going to come back in a cloud, right? Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So
Well, that angel is not directing Jesus. He's relaying a message from God.
Right.
So the angel is not directing him. He's
Right.
relaying a message from God.
correct.
Right.
And the other
But I
verses-
just think it's interesting that the angel, that Jesus had to get that message.
Right. I
Is
see
that
what
all?
you're saying.
That's all.
The other verses are Matthew 24, 36, that says, but about the day or hour no one knows. And then Mark 13:32.
So even right up to the end, Jesus doesn't know until he gets that message. Isn't that interesting? I find that interesting.
Okay, so if you turn out to Revelation 17, when we first talked about the structure of Revelation, we talked about how the end of the book contains two parallel accounts or two parallel visions, or sub-visions we might call, or two things that are held in parallel. And so in order to do that, we're going to look at that real briefly tonight, because we're going to be focusing on the first of those two parallel narratives, and then later we conclude the second of those. So the first of those deals with chapter 17 and 18. But actually, so if you look with me at chapter 17, verses 1 through 3, okay? And I'm going to ask you to keep, when I say I'm going to read it, I want you to keep your hand here, because then we're going to go look at the opening of the parallel account as well, parallel vision. So in verse 1 of 17, one of the seven angels who had the 7 bowls, that's the 7 bowls of God's wrath, came and said to me, come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters, or sits upon many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. And the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. And then I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names, and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, so that's the first account, how it begins. Turn now to Revelation 21. Can't keep your hand back to 17. Chapter 21, and look with me at verses 9 and 10. Okay, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues, or the bowls of God's wrath, came and said to me, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. So I'd like you to notice the parallels. One, in each case we have an angel who would had one of the 7 bowls of God's wrath, who comes to him and invites John to come with him. And he's going to show him something. And in each case he shows John a woman. In the first case, it's the woman who's the great prostitute, and in the second case, it's the bride of Christ. In the first case, this great prostitute is associated, we'll find out, with the city, Babylon the Great, and also with Rome. In the second, the bride of Christ is associated with the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. Okay. See that first opening parallel. Now we're looking at the ending of these sections. See, the endings are also in parallel with each other in some ways. So turn with me to Revelation 19. And look with me at verse 9 of chapter 19. And we're going to start in the middle of the verse. So we saw at 19b. Just to remind you, the verses were added. Revelation was written about 80, let's say in the 80s. If you take the Domitian date, in the 60s if you take the Neronian date. The verses and the chapters were added to this text in the 15th century AD. So 1,500 years later, 400 years later. So you should always keep that in mind, because chapters and verses in the Bible are interpretations. In other words, it's someone interpreting the text. Didn't have that at first. So anyway, in 19b, where it says, "And he said," we'll see that. "And he said, these are the true words of God. At this I fell at his feet to worship him, but he said to me, don't do that. I am a fellow servant with you and with your brothers and sisters who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for it is the spirit of prophecy who bears testimony to Jesus." Okay. Now turn with me to chapter 22. Verses 6 through 9. Chapter 22, verses 6 through 9. "The angel said to me, these words are trustworthy and true. The Lord, the God who inspires the prophets, sent his angel to show his servants the things that must soon take place. Look, I am coming soon. Blessed is the one who keeps the words of the prophecy written in the scroll. I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things, and when I had heard and seen them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who had been showing them to me. But he said to me, don't do that. I am a fellow servant with you and with your fellow prophets and with all who keep the words of this scroll. Worship God." You see how the ending is parallel too. How in this case, in both cases, we have the angel. He addresses him and he talks about how the words are true, the words are of God, and trustworthy. John falls at his feet to worship the angel. The angel tells him to get up because he's a fellow servant of God and of Christ, and he commands him to worship God instead. Okay, so we have. I hope that you can kind of see that we have two passages. They're very different in their internal contents, but at least they're held up as to be compared with each other. In the one, we have a description of a great judgment, which we're going to dig into, and in the latter, we have a description of not judgment, but instead of salvation and victory. Okay, and they're being held in parallel form as sort of they form the climax of the book of Revelation. So with 17 begins the climax of this revelation. So let's dig into it a little bit and see what we can learn. Anyone can give me a sense of what time it is?
1841.
It's what?
1841.
Quarter to 6:41.
Quarter to seven.
Okay. If you open with me to 17, we're going to kind of walk through it a little bit. There's a lot in this chapter that it can be confusing if we don't. First of all, I point to you in verse 1 of 17. It's actually verse 3 of 17. It says, "And he led me away into the desert in the spirit, and I saw a woman sitting upon a red scarlet beast." You remember there are a couple other places we've talked about before when we see this phrase "in the spirit." They mark a major transition in the text. So for instance, the very beginning of the book, it says that he was on the Lord's day in the spirit when he turned and looked, and there was Jesus. Okay? And so he's led in the spirit up to heaven to see the vision of worship in heaven, which then naturally proceeds out to the vision of the different sevens of God's judgment, and then 12 through 14. And now we have the third occasion where we say he's in, or one other occasion when he says he's in the spirit, and he's being led in the spirit. And so we have a dramatic. This is a dramatic marker in the vision that he has. Marks a major change, major transition to a new topic, so to speak. Okay, so we have that marker here. We also have this phrase, "I looked" or "I saw." It is in either of those cases, it's the same word, it's just slightly different tense. But whenever he does that, where he says "I looked" or "I saw," it has the same. It marks a new scene, or so we might call it a scene. If we have a new act, this is basically a new act in the vision, starting with that in the spirit. Now we have sort of scene one. And in the first part of the scene, he sees a woman on many waters, or beside many waters. The phrase there, the preposition that's used, it's often is difficult to translate. In fact, to be honest with you, in the Greek language, in the period of the New Testament, prepositions are difficult to translate because they're losing their meaning, their specificity. Does everyone know what a preposition is? Don't you? Okay.
Or
Yes. Well, if you think about what it is, it's called
position.
preposition. Okay. And in languages like Greek or Latin, where we first see prepositions existing, we notice that what happens is this: we have English is not an inflected language like Spanish is an inflected language. English is what we call an isolating language for the most part. No language is purely one or the other, isolating, inflected, or agglutinating. But they tend to have tendencies. So English, we tell the function of a word generally by its position in the sentence. So usually the subject comes first, followed by the predicate, which includes the verb and the object, and any descriptors of all those kinds of things. So usually it's that pattern. In the Greek language, like in Latin, like in Spanish, we don't tell the function of a word in a sentence by its position or its order that occurs in the sentence. Instead, we add either prefixes to the word or suffixes to the word, or stuff in the middle of the word called infixes. And those things tell us what the function of the word of the sentence is, whether it's a noun, whether it's an adjective, whether it's a verb. And specifically in the case of a noun or an adjective, we say it takes a case, and the case will tell us whether it's the direct object of the sentence, the subject of the sentence, or whether it's been used to show different specific things. In the Greek language, which the New Testament was written in, there's so many varieties of uses, specific detailed uses of cases, that when you just see a word in a particular case, it has so many potential ways of being translated that it was so complicated that people needed a crutch. And so what they did was they created little particle words which they pre-positioned in front of the noun to tell us specifically what sub-usage, what specific usage of a case of that noun is being used, how it's specifically being used. That was the original function of a preposition. By the time of the 1st century, when in the Greek language, the meaning of these prepositions have become extremely vague. And so, it becomes extremely difficult to know exactly how to translate them. So when you see a word like upon or over the waters, as it talks about the woman, it says that she was sitting upon a red scarlet beast. Or it says in the beginning, in the verse 1, we'll show you the judgment of the great prostitute sitting upon the many waters. The translation of that is complicated because we don't exactly know what is meant by the word upon. In fact, there's lots of evidence that this could also be translated that she was sitting by the seashore. That would be actually a very legitimate translation. This actual phrase, though, in this particular instance, has a great deal of significance, and we'll see about that in a minute. So, let's. We've already read the first 3 verses. Let's go ahead and read the rest of 17, because otherwise it'll be confusing to you. So, if you would turn to chapter 17, and would anyone like to volunteer to begin reading verse 4? You will? Okay.
How far do you want me to read or stop?
Why don't you begin in 4 and go through 10.
Okay. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. This title was written on her forehead: Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. The angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come up out of the abyss and go to his destruction. The inhabitants of the earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world will be astonished when they see the beast, because he once was, now is not, and yet will come." This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for a little while.
Okay, now would someone like to read from 11 through, I think, at the end of the chapter, just read 18.
I will. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king, belongs to the 7th and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw were the prostitutes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth."
Okay. A lot in there. A couple comments to start before you're thinking about this. And that is the couple things that we now know. We know that there was a popular style of literature in the Roman Empire that was real popular among the average Roman, not among the elites, but among and it was works that described odd places or odd descriptions that were just like really descriptive books, and they would try to give it an interpretation. So a common one would be one where people traveled to strange like Africa or to India, and they described things they saw, weird animals that they encountered, people dressed in weird things, and they would try to describe them and then try to make sense of them. So there's some correspondence. The reason why I bring that up is because if you're a first century person and you're in the church, you're a Christian, and you read this, it's not going to be perhaps as confusing to them as it might be to us, because this type of descriptive literature, which is similar to the way it's structured, is familiar to them. The other thing I've mentioned in passing, I think last time, was the whole obsession of Roman culture with spectacles, and with they enjoyed and liked and loved to be amazed at odd things, and so they loved the spectacle, and their theater and their plays would try to do that, but also the most important place, their sports events, the same thing. They like big grand spectacle shows, but also more importantly, what happened in the arena would also be full of big spectacles. So at the arena, a typical day, let's say starting with the time of Nero and later, what would happen at the arena was that in the morning, the day when they had things going on at the arena would start at about 9:30, 10 in the morning, and average people would go there because they would usually it was for a festival, they get the day off from work, but also because as part of this spectacle at the arena, there'd be a portion of the time where they would get free handouts, you'd win prizes. So people wanted to get there to get a chance to get the prize.
The T-shirt.
Right, exactly, but in this case it was usually food. Food. Hence the phrase bread and circuses. And the reason why that would be an important thing, if you're living in, we now, economists have taken the time to carefully work through this from the evidence we have. If you are an average person living in Rome in the first century, or it doesn't have to be Rome, it could be one of these cities in Asia Minor, and you have a typical job, you're a working man, a working family, sort of working class people, not among the 1% elite, that what happens is that income goes, if you take all your income and you break it down in your budget, how much has to go to rent, how much has to go to the daily stuff of life, that you would be short about 10% of what you would need to supply a family of 4 with food on your table. Okay? In other words, even if you worked full time, and your wife worked, and your children worked, everyone who worked and could work, you would still run about 10% short of what you would need to survive. We're not talking about to have an extra amount of food. We're talking about just to have subsistence food, caloric content, so that you were dependent on going to the arena and getting there for the free handouts, because that would make up the difference. So they got a lot of people to come. And at the arena at 9:30, 10 o'clock, the first thing would happen was they would take people who had been condemned to death, criminals, and they would dress them up in odd costumes. And then they'd put them on unusual animals, maybe to depict a historical event in the past, or just sort of like a circus kind of thing. And they would have a parade that would bring them into the arena. They would be all dressed up, they'd kind of be tied to the animal in some ways. And then at some point, as part of the ceremony for that spectacle and the oddity of it, and all the lavish dress, they might dress person up in really fancy clothes, they would strip them naked, and then they would kill them, whether they would feed them to wild animals, or whether they would crucify them, or they would give them to the gladiators to kill, or they would just torture them to death. That was what would happen, and people would go and pay. It was a big popular thing to see this spectacle. It seems gruesome and kind of gross to us today and weird, but that was that culture. And people who are reading this book had been in this revelation are hearing it have been immersed in that culture for hundreds of years now. By the time the first century arrives, and that's when they think of entertainment. That's what they think about. We might think about football or soccer or baseball or something. They think about this. They didn't have TV. If you look at what's on TV and how violent it is, we're getting close, you know. So, but this is what they like. Okay, so what I want to point out to you is the scene of this great prostitute being brought in on this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns is the kind of thing that they would, a kind of spectacle kind of scene that they would see as part of the pageantry of the arena before the gruesome time of judgment and condemnation came. Okay?
Same parallel, yeah.
Okay, so
And the criminals would get judged.
that's right. They'd already been judged and condemned. They would get their judgment meted out, condemnation. The word for judgment here about the Babylon the Great is actually the word condemnation, and it means the inaction of the acting out of judgment, not just the pronouncement of judgment. Okay, so how is this woman on the beast, scarlet beast described? What can you tell me about her?
Dressed in purple and scarlet.
Dressed in purple and
Glittering
scarlet. What does that mean?
stones and
Well
pearls.
dressed.
Well,
That's royal, yeah, more royalty.
Okay, purple
and-
means only kings usually can afford that, and scarlet is the clothing of luxury. So if you go to Neiman Marcus or something like that, the kind of clothes you buy at Neiman Marcus. Okay. So she's dressed well. What else does she have on her?
gold,
Gold and
precious
precious stones and pearls.
Gold, precious stones, and pearls,
and a golden cup.
and a golden cup. What's in her cup?
Ugly
Filthy
stuff.
things. All the
What
filth,
specifically is in the cup?
all the filth of her adultery.
Adulteries.
Abominable things.
Okay, abominable things and things that and things that of the filth of our adulteries. If you look at the original, it says that they are in there. What's in there are things which are so sacrilegious that they make a place that they come in contact with unholy, or they defile a place. And it speaks of the. It talks about the her adulteries as being defiling as well. So if you think about this, what he's saying is in her cup is that which defiles places, people, and things.